Hey Swifties! Welcome to a brand new episode of Swifty School, where together we walk Clownelia Street covering the latest news and Easter eggs from our fearless leader, Taylor Swift. I'm your host, Reagan Bailey, and it is enchanting to have you here. Now that we're out of the woods, let's get into today's episode. It's another great day to be alive at the same time as Taylor Swift. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm currently reporting live from London in real time, but we're doing a little pre-recorded episode today, and I'm so excited. But before we get into the episode, quick disclaimer that this podcast is just an expression of my thoughts and opinions, and in no way am I associated with Taylor Swift or Taylor Nation, although I would absolutely love to be. Now, I've been teasing today's guest for a while. I am so jazzed to finally have somebody back. This is very long awaited. I feel like we've been talking about having a guest on the podcast for a while, and I'm very excited to announce Jake. Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. I love your disclaimer. I too would love to be associated with Taylor Swift or Taylor Nation, but unfortunately I'm not.
Yes, I feel like, unfortunately, I do have to say that because some people are like, wait, do you work for Taylor? I'm like, no.
I sometimes get that as well.
I would love that. I'm flattered that the clownery is that intense. But I want to do a brief intro of you to everybody because some people are not on the Clock app who follow me over on Instagram or maybe just found the podcast organically. So you are what we consider a Swift talker, and you've got over 200,000 followers. You make content about what I specifically love is like your content about the charts and like the music industry, but you also kind of talk about like Taylor's legacy and just Swiftivities in general. So give everyone who doesn't know who you are, or hasn't seen your video or face pop up, just a little overview of your content and what they can expect.
Yeah, so I originally started by posting like Taylor Swift songs that I had rewritten. And that was sort of like how I got my start on TikTok. Like I did All Too Well from the perspective of who we think it's written about. I did a couple of other songs like that. Always very flattering to Taylor. And that, I mean, it's so removed from what my current content is. So I always think it's fun that was just sort of how I dipped my toe in the water. But since then, it's a lot more commentary, sort of, as you said, I love breaking down charts, numbers. I mean, Taylor's legacy is so phenomenal. And I think that that's something that we sort of intrinsically feel as Swifties. And it's always fun to be able to assign, to be like, this is actually measurable. Like we can see just how hard she's slaying, like with cold, hard facts. So I would say that's probably the majority of what I talk about.
I love the cold, hard facts. And I think with like, we've talked a lot about on this podcast, sort of reining it in with like the latest Swiftivities, I think because of social media. And I love how you've leveraged social media to talk about the cold, hard facts, because on the opposite, there are so many people not talking about the facts and just kind of utilizing Taylor Swift as a means to get clout or gain virality or popularity on social media. But like you said, what I love that you're doing is you are talking about something that's really factual and interesting is that her numbers are unlike anything we've seen before, which I have a lot of questions for you to get into. But before we do that, I want to know about, your background. Obviously, I'm a big math nerd. So I'm like, are you into math? Do you like numbers? What did you do before this? Is this your full-time job? Tell us about that.
Sure. So I definitely loved math in school, an AP Calc guy. But I sort of pivoted when I went to university. I went to NYU and I was actually like a drama theater major there, which I feel like sort of goes hand in hand with the Taylor Swift of it all. Like she's a total theater kid. Mm-hmm. And then once I was done with my college years, I sort of decided that wasn't really the route I wanted to take. I mean, it's like a brutal lifestyle. And so I sort of pivoted toward education, which is what my whole family has done like my whole life. And so I taught school for a couple of years. Then I started working in higher education, working in admissions. But that sort of thing is also so data driven. So I've always had sort of a through line of tracking data, having a like kind of a major interest in data. And it's also one of the ways that I first got into Taylor Swift. I loved tracking. I remember tracking the iTunes sales of We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together. And just following it like hour to hour and just being like, oh my God, she's slaying. And I was like, little teenager at the time. But now I recently moved away from my kind of corporate job and I'm doing content creation full time, which is such an enormous blessing. And it's like, I still have to like pinch myself and be like, it's so validating to know the thing that I have been severely interested in for the last 20 years is shared by enough people who allow me to do it as a full-time job. I mean, I'm sure you have a similar feeling of like how lucky it is to make content about something that you have felt passionately about for so long and actually have that be sort of what you do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because ironically, this is the thing I stayed away from with my content for so long. Like I really was quite resistant to it because I felt like, oh, I don't want to be categorized as this fangirl, or, oh, you know, is it really now? Obviously, it's like very cool to like Taylor Swift, but as you know, it used to not be. And so I kind of felt like I was like, is this going to be a turnoff to certain brands, or will I lose people? And what I found is, like you said, the community aspect of it is fantastic, but being able to add your own twist on it as a creator and how you want to shape it as your career is really cool. And like you said, it all comes down to the commentary and what you have to contribute. So I was always worried that there was going to be too many people doing the same thing as me, or there's already a million fan accounts. What more can I contribute? But to your point, I think it's awesome that we've kind of found those niches for ourselves, which is really cool and such an interesting pivot from education. I like finding sort of the invisible string behind like your past and your future and present with sort of Taylorisms, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it's been such an amazing transition and like something that I feel super lucky to be a part of.
So you had mentioned before we talked and started recording some of your favorite Taylor songs, which I thought were interesting because definitely a lot of crossover with mine. So you said if you had to pick 3 favorite Taylors, it would be Wildest Dreams, August, and Lover. Have you been a Swiftie through all of these eras? I know you mentioned We're Never Getting Back Together, but what was sort of like your inception of loving Taylor and finding an interest in her career?
I have a memory of like the first time I heard a Taylor Swift song. I was on my way back from camping. My aunt came to pick me up and our song came on the radio and she basically said, "You're going to love this song. You're going to be obsessed with it." And it played and she was 100% right. So our song was definitely sort of my gateway into being a Swiftie. And I would say, sort of around that Fearless era was when I was like, this is forever. And so I still a lot of favorites from that sort of those early days, but certainly all the way through. Like I never really had, I know it was kind of a natural thing for a lot of people to have these kind of, ebbs and flows of interest in Taylor. I've never ebbed. It's always been a flow. I was always perched for every single album release. I think that the album that probably kind of pushed me over the edge to being like, this is like a part of my personality. Like I want people to think about me when they think about Taylor Swift was Red. It's the first album I ever owned. It came out the year that I started driving. So I had it in my car. And it was like the first time I'd ever had like a real CD because, up until that point, I just sort of bought everything on iTunes. And I just played it constantly every day on my way to school. Every time someone rode with me, they knew that we were listening to Red. And so I have like a very special connection to that album. And then the Taylor's version release, I feel like just was probably my favorite Taylor Swift era of all time. I mean, as many people agree, something was in the water when that was happening.
Oh, yeah.
And just sort of like cemented that legacy for me. I'm total Red.
That's so funny because Red, like a lot of people that write into the podcast, Red is the one people would get rid of. And it's
Really?
funny. Yeah, it's really funny. Like a lot of people don't feel that emotional connection to it, but I think it's interesting depending on what generation, like, or what age range you fall into. I think there's certain albums that like people are really, really honed into, and Red seems to be one of them for people that are kind of our age.
Yeah, I totally agree.
What I think is interesting for OG Swifties that I feel like you can probably speak on is how I've kind of mentioned it earlier, like it used to not be cool to be a Taylor Swift fan. And there's been sort of this crazy trajectory of her career. And now I feel like she's sort of reached this like untouchable kind of territory that we look at a lot of like the greats, the Beatles, Michael Jackson, etc. I'm curious to know, well, we talk a lot about where does she go from here? What happens after eras for Taylor? And as a lifelong fan, but also someone interested in like the music industry in general, what do you think her next move will be following Eras Tour?
I think that's a great question because I think, we are now kind of comparing her to these kind of all-timers, but even amongst the all-timers, there isn't really a precedent for what Taylor is currently doing. By the time 2 decades had passed when the Beatles had formed, they weren't even a band anymore. By the time 2 decades had passed for Madonna, for Michael Jackson, artists that I want to put every ounce of respect on their names that they deserve, but they were not experiencing, there was a hotter new artist around. Like they may have still been experiencing success, but like Taylor is unequivocally still the hottest, most successful artist on the planet. And I think that that is really unique to be doing that like a full 2 decades in, to be like, if you ask any person on the street right now, like who is the most successful musician in the world, they would say Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
And so it is fascinating to sort of plan the rest of her career because there is no mold for this. There is no kind of version for this. By the time 20 years had passed, these artists had already started transitioning into legacy acts, which I think we've seen Taylor sort of embrace with the Eras Tour and the Taylor's Version project. But she is not just a legacy act. I mean, the Tortured Poets Department just spent more weeks at #1 than any other Taylor Swift album ever. And it's her brand new album, So I'm very curious to see where we go. I've often thought as a fan who has enjoyed this sort of legacy work and looking back at artists' careers, I remember having these vivid moments of like, okay, it can't get any bigger. Like after 1989 happened, I was like, this is the peak. Like this, she may still have consistency, but this is going to be the biggest she's ever felt. And then I remember, being proved wrong about that and feeling that way around the Midnight's release and being like, wow, she has re-peaked somehow, like by kind of embracing this new and legacy artist thing at the same time. And then even Midnight's has been crushed by the dominance of this era's era. And it's just, I've stopped trying to guess when we're finally going to kind of cross that mountain because she just keeps building higher. So, I want to say the sky's the limit. Like she could go even bigger. I think there's going to be so much hype around Taylor Swift 13 that I wouldn't be surprised if she outdoes her Tortured Poets Department numbers for that album, which feels insane to say about an artist who's been in the game for almost 20 years.
I think it's interesting too, because I think it was unintentional. I talk a lot about Taylor Swift as individual and then Taylor Swift as a brand. And I think the AOS Tour was intentional in a way of, like most people, 17 years into their career, AOS Tour made sense. She's got enough discography. She's got enough to cover and span. If she could do a 6-hour show, heck, like forget Torture Post Department. Like we have to add that in. And so I think unintentionally the AOS Tour, it seemed almost like it could have been a legacy moment, but now it kind of catapulted her into this like completely different realm that we didn't even think of. But then Torture Poets Department came out. And I think my initial thought, first listen, was this was for the fans. It wasn't for anybody else. I don't know if this is going to rein in like people who were iffy about her or uninterested previously. And it clearly was proven wrong by the statistics that you just mentioned. I love that both of our cats want to be included in this.
They're both Swifties.
They're both Swifties. Totally. I have like both of them right here. But I think Torture Poets Department is interesting to me because it feels, we're looking at like the mass scheme of a huge resurgence of like pop music. It feels like if 1989 were released right now in like the Chappell Roan, Sabrina, Olivia Rodrigo era, like it would just be so fitting. But Torture Poets Department has held its own. Why do you think that is? Why is it working so well amongst the landscape of music right now?
I think that's a great question. And I think that the thing that Taylor, to me, one of the reasons that she has always kind of maintained this level of success and notoriety is that she refuses to chase a trend. Like she is never, you get this sense, especially as artists sort of go through the natural aging process, that if they feel as though that they're not cool anymore, that they need to, kind of chase the sound of what's big at the moment. And Taylor has always followed her gut, like she talked about, I believe it was the Time interview where she was like, I bet on myself. I'm always betting on myself. And I think that Taylor, with the Tortured Poets Department, to your point, I felt the same way when I heard it. I was like, this is for the fans. I think that Taylor made the album that she wanted to make, was not so concerned with being like, I need a giant pop song. I need another Cruel Summer sort of moment on this album. She was like, I'm feeling these feelings. I'm going to write my truth. And in the end, that is always what is a checkmate for her. Like that's what people in the end want. They want the honesty that, you can sort of suss out when an artist is trying a little too hard and like,
I agree,
to fit that mold of the current sound. And Taylor has never been interested in fitting the mold. Like she's gonna make a Taylor Swift record. She's not going to be like, this is what's selling right now, so I'm gonna follow that. I mean, we've seen her shift her sound so many times in ways that should be perceived as incredibly risky. I think people sometimes accuse her of not having a risky career, but it's just because all the risks have paid off.
Yeah.
When she's actually had a very, very risky career. So I think, I really just think she made the album she wanted to make, and she's being rewarded for that as per usual, because normally the album that she wants to make is an album a lot of people end up wanting to listen to.
Yeah, I think to your point about not following trends, something I've always admired her for is she's not a trend follower in pretty much every regard. Like she's pretty nerdy, and like she says that, and she's, she doesn't dress overly trendy. She's pretty modest. Like she doesn't fit the mold of a billionaire, like the biggest A-lister of all time pop star. And that's what's most fascinating to me, is how she's remained so relatable and humble. Like I feel like she's very much girl next door, but she's also Taylor Swift. And there's like this weird dichotomy there, whereas I look at someone like Lady Gaga and I'm like, oh wow, I can't relate to this woman at all, but I'm obsessed with her. And it's a different level. I think that's why the fandom for Taylor, I would love someone to do like a psychology study on the fandom of Taylor. But I think you ask any Taylor Swift fan and it's like, oh yeah, me and her would like get along if you put us in a room together.
Yeah.
Like
I think that's a fantastic point. I mean, she's your best friend. She's your cool big sister. It's like, there is that sense of like, we would be friends. Like, it's not this, like I have so much reverence for her, but to your point, like there are these other stars that you feel a little unapproachable by. And sometimes that's their appeal, like they feel like they're on this Mount Olympus sort of situation. But Taylor, despite being on the top of Mount Olympus, it feels like you could just sit in a room and have a conversation with her or approach her in public. And like, it is incredible that she has maintained that image despite what she has accomplished.
Yeah. Have you ever met Taylor before?
I've not. I've only interacted with her online. She's commented on a few of my videos, but I would love to meet her. Have you?
I have not met. Well, so I've been in the same room as her. I went to the premiere for the AOS Tour film, and
that's amazing.
She came into the theater. Her parents were sitting behind me, which was really cool. I feel like I had to be so I was obviously into the movie, but I had to be really into it.
When the Swifts are watching you, there's some pressure.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, that was the closest I ever got to her, was in the theater, but I wanted to be it was sort of an elevated event. There was a lot of celebrities there, so I didn't want to be outrageous and yell anything out. So I had to really keep it tame. But I always say, what are the things I would ask Taylor? And I think a lot of people from the outside would be like, would you be able to keep your composure? And I'm like, oh, absolutely. I don't want to ask the things that I think most people think. I'm like, I just want to know the inner workings of this woman's brain. What's your nighttime skincare routine? Do you, what does a typical day in the life of her look like?
I want to know what time she goes to bed. I'm always fascinated. I'm like, sometimes I'm like, it seems like you never rest or sleep. I want to know, are you a night owl? Are you lurking? I would love to know the mundane things about her.
That's how I feel as well, because that's where the elusiveness has come in. Is I feel like I know so much, but I also know so little, which is also part of the lore. But you had mentioned earlier about Taylor being on the charts for 14 weeks. And I think this is a really interesting topic, because so many people, I think there's been some fatigue when it comes to basically Taylor Swift and her success, because like you said, she continues to, not fatigue for fans, but fatigue, media fatigue, because it just seems like, yes, we know she's on top. We know she's doing well, but I don't think the gravity of her being on the Billboard for 14 weeks straight is really going to resonate with a lot of these. The current headlines aren't doing justice, is basically what I'm trying to get at. So you've reported on this quite a bit, blocking Kanye's #1 streak and kind of where Taylor's at in the term of the greats when it comes to Elvis and how many weeks he was on top during his career. So I'd love for you to kind of expand upon that and your thoughts as to, is Torture Post Department tapering off? Can it hold on a little bit longer? What'll that look like?
I definitely think that she could spend more weeks at #1. Even without doing anything else. I think were she to release the anthology on a physical edition, that would definitely lock up at least a couple more weeks. I really am fingers crossed that she's going to do that for the holiday season. Makes me a little scared that we never got the Midnight's 3 a.m. vinyl, so I guess we'll have to wait and see. But there is obviously so much interest. And I do think that you make a great point when you talk about that sort of Taylor Swift's charts fatigue in the media. I think she is so successful that it's hard to contextualize her success.
Totally.
Because we're just getting kind of inundated all the time with her shattering a 50-year-long standing record. But one thing that I found that gave me a lot of context just for the Tortured Poets departments around at #1 is that she has actually spent more weeks at #1 with just the Tortured Poets department than so many A-list stars have spent in their entire careers on the Billboard 200. The Tortured Poets department, and I want to be very clear that I'm not saying this to drag any of these successful, amazing, talented artists, just kind of to give the context of how earth-shattering this achievement is. The Tortured Poets department has spent more weeks at #1 than the entire careers of artists like Justin Bieber, Lady Gaga, Beyonce. She tied Kanye West's career weeks at #1 this week with 14.
Wow.
And so I feel like that sort of gives you an idea of what a special achievement this is. I mean, when you look at these all-time lists, they're also completely filled up with artists from the 70s and 80s and 90s, because the music industry has changed so much. So not only is Taylor achieving this, outright, which is already very, very difficult to do, even if she had debuted back in the day, you also get the context of this has become much harder as the music industry has gone on for a whole myriad of reasons. Billboard talks about it all the time. But the fact that Taylor is setting the records in the first place is impressive enough. But then to have the added context of comparing her to her peers and seeing just how insane it is that she has managed to set these records in the current music industry climate, I feel adds a whole other layer of she truly is doing something that no one else is even close to touching. And I know that this is a big statement. I genuinely think that she will have the most impressive musical legacy of any artist in history by the time it's over.
That was one of my next questions for you, was what do you think it will take for her to be the #1 charted artist of all time? Do you think, how long career-wise, because is it the Beatles that's #1?
It's the Beatles. And they're a distant #1. So I think that will be a really, really long game. I mean, obviously the Beatles have had time to accrue these units over the course of decades and decades and decades of love. I think what people have yet to realize is the wave of young children and children yet to be born who are going to grow up listening to Taylor Swift in the same way that we might have grown up listening to artists like Michael Jackson and Madonna and the Beatles because our parents loved them so much. And so there's a whole wave of future Swifties that are going to be raised by the current crop. And I think it'll take a lot of time. I say that, and I may be proven wrong, because back even 5 years ago was the first time maybe when it started to become apparent that she would have a chance to sort of chase after an artist like Madonna. And at the time, I remember thinking, okay, maybe this will happen in 10 years, 15 years. She'll pass Madonna's lifetime units. She's going to pass Madonna next year. So the rate at which she has kind of started accruing these units has really sped up. I mean, we'll see if that maintains. The Taylor's Version project has done a lot. She's obviously released a lot of music. I don't know that that rate will be realistic for her to continue, but I think that we could see her topping the soloist list in sooner than 10 years. I think for the Beatles, it'll be a longer game, but I do think that she will get there.
I agree with you completely. I think there's a whole new wave, and I wholeheartedly believe we've talked a lot about the Taylor's versions and what's remaining, and I think there's immense strategizing going into how do we roll out debut, how do we roll out Reputation, because I truly think there's opportunity. I mean, I think Reputation will break the internet. I think there's fan or not fan people, there's just so much riding on this, and I think it has to be done so properly in order to really, longevity wise, for charting, rolling. I mean, this could be dragged out, we know as Taylor fans, like variant wise, merch wise. I mean, we've been talking about Disney Plus and buying Reputation Stadium Tour. Is there going to be a bonus footage that comes out? She could really leverage that. But I'm curious, do you think the Taylor's version dragging out those last two re-records is something that we'll see to help her charting? Or do you think she's going to want to get those kind of pushed out of the way so that she's done with the eras as we know it and can kind of move into whatever her next passion project would be, which is assuming TS12 and 13?
I definitely think there are pros and cons for sort of both tactics in terms of like commercial performance. The Eras Tour is such a wild card in all of this. And that is something I think Taylor plans a lot. I think she obviously intended the Eras Tour to be this massive, wonderful spectacle. I don't think anyone could have predicted the effects that the Eras Tour was going to have on her discography. No. And I mean, Billboard has written great articles about how it's like a Super Bowl effect every single weekend. I mean, I remember watching the initial numbers come up, like her daily streams. At the beginning of 2023, she and Bad Bunny were very neck and neck in daily streams. They would sort of pass that baton back and forth. Since the Eras Tour started, Taylor has almost consistently been doing over double the amount of daily streams on Spotify of any other artist. I mean, the effects that the tour has had, as someone who has like followed this my whole life, it is still unbelievable to me. And so I think that it makes sense for me for her to at least want to squeeze out one of them before this is all over, because people are so checked in. People love watching her perform the music. I mean, like getting to do the new songs as surprise songs, I think is an incredible way to like generate buzz and hype. And, every time she's performed a Tortured Poets song, we see that go really viral and sort of take over the internet for a couple of days. So I really think that we'll see at least one more before the Eras Tour wraps up. It makes sense also for her to save something for next year, because we know that she is, working on a movie. She may have a quieter year. And that is something that doesn't need as much promotion as a new album. So I think that she'll also have a terrific narrative if they do it in sort of the order of Reputation and then debut, which I think is what a lot of people think is going to happen. I love the narrative of like, she's finally reclaimed all of her old work by going back to the very first album. So I think that narrative sort of builds itself in terms of, that commercial push and how they're going to market things. But my prediction would be Reputation this year. Really hopeful it's going to be announced in London. And then I think debut maybe sometime in 2025 to sort of close the chapter on this. And then forward, as you say, to, TS12, TS13.
I have two questions. Is it normal, as someone who follows a lot of the data with artists, is it normal for their discography to get a boost while they're on tour? Is that something that's a trend typically?
Typically, it's a very modest boost, and it happens kind of just with the first dates of the tour. What the Eras Tour has done, I mean, it truly is like she's performed the Super Bowl. I mean, like people ask me all the time about like why Taylor doesn't do TV performances anymore. And my answer is that she has no incentive. Like the Eras Tour is being that closely monitored by that many people, and it's having such a positive effect on her discography. Like, why not control the conditions in which you're performing these songs? If you have that opportunity, if you have kind of the platform that she has built just from this tour, she has no reason to perform at the Grammys. She honestly, I hope she does the Super Bowl one day, but she honestly has no reason to do it. Like the boost that she's experienced from the Eras Tour, is actually, if you look up the kind of the breakdown of the numbers, is actually greater than a Super Bowl boost. And I remember when it initially happened, like opening weekend, Billboard wrote about it and they were like, this is crazy and unprecedented and it's obviously going to die down. Hasn't died down at all. Like her streaming numbers, she's still doing, regularly 60, 70, 80 million streams per day. And the next closest artist is doing 40 million. And those artists, those are artists that are coming and going as they release music. Taylor has just stayed planted at the summit. Like the boost from the AOS Tour is truly kind of like a once in a lifetime thing, just like so many aspects of the AOS Tour.
Totally. What do you think? We had mentioned, thinking reputation then debut, and I'm totally aligned with that. I've always thought a really big risk for Taylor is with the opportunity of debut TV, she really can dip her toe back into it's an organic dip. Like we saw Beyonce do this kind of, it seemed clunky, kind of coming out with Cowboy Carter and the receptive, it was iffy on people being receptive to it or not. But I think it would be really organic for Taylor to finish with debut, and then she could sort of get a temperature check on if people are interested, if she's interested in her dabbling with country, because I think country, since debut has come out, is a completely different genre. I mean, we're seeing,
for sure.
I can't even describe. I'm like Post Malone doing country. Like we just have such a different landscape when it comes to country. Morgan Wallen. Do you think that that's something we would see from her, or would you be interested in that?
I would love to see Taylor revisit country. I mean, like those albums are so special to me, and I think she does it so well, and it plays to a lot of her strengths. Like the narrative storytelling in her music. I love all those old country tropes. So where you get like half the chorus the first time and then the full chorus the second time, like You Belong With Me, changing the lyrics from chorus to chorus. I think country really plays to what makes Taylor Swift Taylor Swift. And I think it would be such a resounding victory lap for her to return to that. That's actually very high on my list of if I was getting to plan Taylor Swift's career, if I had that privilege, I would definitely want to see that in the near future. I think it would also be kind of cool to do it for Taylor Swift 13. Or, I think that album will have so much hype and pressure that I'm interested to see what she decides to do, if she's going to try to go kind of classic Taylor or branch out and take another creative risk. I personally would also love to see a straight up dance music record from her, sort of like what she so successfully made with This Is What You Came For. She obviously has the talent to make that sort of music, and it's sort of an unturned stone for her. So I'm always thinking about like, what are those places where we've seen her dabble her feet, like rock music, like the arrangement we got of We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together and I Knew You Were Trouble live, where they have those rock elements. I would love to see that. Really, any of those avenues I think would be fruitful for her. But I do hope, sometime in the near future, whatever she chooses, I think it would be awesome to see her sort of return to those roots and do a little country record.
I do too. And I think she has that freedom now because she's clearly secured, this sort of untouchable spot, that I think she has the freedom to do that. But something that a lot of people are very critical of her and I want to hear your thoughts on this as someone who watches a lot of this data, because I've talked at great length about this. And I actually think I shared one of your video commentary about this on a previous episode, is the criticism of her dropping variants. This is not uncommon for artists, yet somehow Taylor is the person who gets the most flack for it. And I could say a lot about why Taylor constantly seems to be the person who gets flack for things that everyone seems to be doing. Specifically at the time, I think when I had mentioned it, was people were comparing Billie Eilish and the number of variants she had and whatever it was. So not to compare, but do you think that this is a smart move? What is your opinion on artists releasing variants and counting towards their charts? Is this Taylor's decision at all? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think that Taylor uses them in like a very specific sort of way for very close chart battles. It turns out, like, out of all of the weeks the Tortured Poets Department has spent at number one, the variants have made a difference in the US for about 3 of those weeks. The week that Billie released, I think Luke Bryant released one week, and now this latest release with Kanye. Otherwise, the Tortured Poets Department would have been number one regardless. And, all of those other artists that I just mentioned were also doing the exact same thing in their release weeks and fighting for that number one. In fact, Billie Eilish actually had the best week of her career in album sales from the chart battle that she had with Taylor Swift. Like, she didn't go number one, but it was her biggest week ever on the charts. And so, I completely agree with you that I think that Taylor gets a really unfair amount of scrutiny for this. But that's not, unfortunately, that's nothing new. You look at the private jet usage, for instance,
right.
Other celebrities who I love, Beyonce can literally post a selfie in her private jet. And Beyonce, I feel like, is a good comparison because she is also AAA plus list. She's a billionaire. And yet you don't, no noise, and everybody is talking about Taylor Swift's jet usage all the time, even though Taylor, what's the internet trend right now? Very demure, very cutesy, very mindful. Taylor is not out here trying to draw attention. She's kind of quiet. When this chart battle was happening, and Billie Eilish, unfortunately, who I love, number 2 artist on my Spotify Wrapped, actually, but was constantly putting her foot in her mouth. Do you know who wasn't saying anything? Taylor Swift. Like, she knows how to sort of keep herself locked down. But there is a kind of a frustrating aspect to that, because I'm like, I want you to feel like you can defend yourself, but these people have already decided that you're guilty before they've even like heard the data on this. Like the Brat album release in the UK, when Taylor also would have been number one without the variants. It's like, people don't care about the truth though. Like, they hear the soundbite and they just want to run with the, oh no, Taylor Swift's not a girl's girl, she's the chart monster.
And the reality is, at the end of the day, Taylor is the one uplifting all of these artists. And
Yes.
I say this all the time. Taylor walked so these artists could run, because I really think so much of what she's done, removing her music or discography from Spotify, like making a statement with the Taylor's versions and the re-records, like she's done so much to pave the way for a lot of these artists that are having these huge moments.
And she's constantly giving them platforms. Like on the AOS Tour, she's had so many opening acts. Like, she's one of the most supportive people in the industry. She's so free with a compliment. She's always engaged at award shows, and somehow people still criticize her for that. Like,
yeah, exactly. You had mentioned Billie Eilish as one of your other Spotify Wrapped artists. Who are some other, I always say like 90% Taylor, 10% other artists, but I do love music in general. So who do you like or listen to outside of Taylor?
I feel the same way. It's an obscene amount of Taylor versus the other artists, but I love Billie's music. I've always been a Lady Gaga fan, not to just like talk about the artists we've already discussed, but I love Beyonce. Definitely more like mainstream acts. I very, very seldom listen to men.
Okay.
I listen to a little Harry Styles, listen to a little Noah Kahan, but I would say definitely sort of that crop of pop stars that we grew up with, like the Rihannas, the Katies, like that good old late aughts, early 2010s group of gals. Like those are my gals.
I love it. I love Lady Gaga as well. She's an icon and a legend. I think we had touched on it briefly in the beginning, but we've seen this sort of female artists are taking over. They're having a massive moment. And I've talked before about my opinion on, I think COVID, in that post-COVID era, we really needed sort of something fun. I know we needed it. And I think music was something that we could all turn to. And obviously we know the music cycle, it takes a little bit to make albums. It takes time for, music festivals are happening again. And we mentioned Taylor's had a big role in this. So with that, we've seen artists like Chappell Roan, who's had these explosive numbers over the past 6 months. I saw Chappell Roan in April, and the stage at Coachella was so tiny versus now we're seeing footage from Lollapalooza, these massive festivals. I want to know, kind of completely opposite of Taylor, someone who's completely boomed early in their career versus Taylor, which was a bit of a slower burn. Do you think that artists like Chappell Roan, Olivia Rodrigo, who had these huge booms early on when they reached mainstream success, are going to have a difficult time keeping up with that or maintaining it? Or has social media created a landscape where they're able to just sort of ride that wave?
So I think social media has actually made it so much harder to maintain relevance as an artist. I think Taylor has had to deal with that as well, but I think that she sort of eked in right under the rug of like the more traditional molded pop star, like where you had those like post-release album singles where you had true album eras. I mean, think about an era like 1989 that basically lasted over 2 years, where we had like 7 singles. All of them had huge music videos, award show performances. Modern music will not tolerate that type of era. Like, if an artist builds an era that way, it's because they did all of the music as like pre-release songs and then they put out an album at the very end. Very, very occasionally you get someone who really defies and bucks the trend, like what is happening with Chappell Roan right now, where she's been enjoying a lot of success across a lot of different songs. But I think that social media makes it a lot easier to get that viral hit. It makes it a lot easier to have that initial notice. What is hard is to dig your claws in and stick around, because people have such short attention spans. It really takes, to look at Taylor's career, she built this house, brick by brick over a long period of time to create this relationship that she has with us, where we are ride or die for this woman. Like, we are not turning our backs on her. And I think that to do that in this modern music industry climate is really difficult, because that takes investment. I think about the amount of time in my life I've dedicated to being a Swiftie. And like, at some point you sort of reach that point of no return of like, this is part of me. And I think that part of that investment requires 5-10 years of loving an artist. And I think that this social media of it all and this very, very changing landscape of music industry that's happening every couple of years makes that really hard. And so I love these artists. I'm really, really hopeful that they're able to sort of dig in and latch, because I think they're incredibly talented. But we even see, from era to era, Olivia, I think, has had a little more trouble on the charts and like sticking around, even from, her first album to her sophomore album. And I think that is a direct result of changing norms in the music industry. I think Guts is a fantastic record, but I think there's just less room, like you really have to carve out this giant space for yourself right now in order to stick out from the crowd. And people just have so much more choice, like we have the internet at our fingertips all the time, that you have to be really, really interesting to keep those attentions engaged because people have so many other options. And so I think that they have their work cut out for them. I hope the examples you gave especially, I think are incredibly talented musicians. Chappell Roan, I'll add her to like some of my complete faves right now. Like that record is so good.
So fantastic.
And so I'm really hopeful that she's going to be able to do what it takes. It seems like she has a strong kind of artistic brand as well. And I think that is really required. Like you have to be bigger than the music. And I think that Taylor encapsulates that so well of like, it's everything. It's the image, it's the relatability, it's the relationship with your fans, it's the fashion, it's the lore. And I think that Chappell is leaning into that as well. And I hope that we can continue to see success from those artists.
I do too. What I love about Chappell is it feels like Lady Gaga in a new, modern, fresh, funky way. And we haven't seen that from really anybody. Nobody takes the same risks as Lady Gaga's in her own category, but she takes risks that nobody else does.
Yeah, I loved when she came out as like the Statue of Liberty. Like I was like, that's so inspired to paint your whole body. Like,
or the butterfly moment was iconic.
Oh my God, yeah.
I love the themes too, like how she gives her fans themes. There's just a lot of interaction happening with her that I really like. Now, I love to end every episode with Swifty Submissions, which is where people who are listening can send in stuff. And there was an overwhelming amount of people who were talking about the VMAs specifically. And what do we expect from Taylor this year? What do we think is going to happen? I had talked on Instagram about my personal thoughts that I think rather than being a one-trick pony and Taylor sort of repeating what we saw previously in the award season for Georgia Post Department and making the announcement there, I think we might just see something a little bit more muted, like Easter egg through her nails or through her outfit, alluding as to what might be coming next if something doesn't happen in London. So by the time this comes out, we'll already know if something happened in London and you guys will be super happy and I will be too. But if nothing happened in London, hypothetically, do you have eyes on the VMAs? And if so, what are your predictions?
I gotta say, I really think something is gonna happen in London. But if it does not, then I definitely think Taylor knows that we're looking right now. She knows that we're like waiting and like that hype is building back up. Obviously, there's been like a Reputation TV theory every weekend for the last year.
Yes.
So I think that no matter what, I do think that she will engage with that in some way. I actually like completely agree with you that I would be kind of shocked if she used it as another announcement. I think that to also kind of loop back to that media fatigue, I think that there were some kind of unkind reactions to her Tortured Poets announcement at the Grammys.
Yeah.
So I would be surprised if she took the exact same route. If we've yet to hear anything though, I do think that she will be, sending us signals in other ways, like with what she's wearing. Like I used to always have this vision of her attending an award show with like tape on her mouth that said no explanation. Like I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to take your questions. Like I could see something like that happening, like where she's doing a very obvious hat tip. But I do think it's coming soon. I think we'll have it this holiday season.
I completely agree. It just makes sense. The eggs are egging. Well, this was so much fun. I really love numbers, and it's hard to find people who find enjoyment in numbers as much as I do. So I really love chatting with you about this, and I love consuming your content. Like I mentioned, I've shared it in the broadcast channel before, but for anybody who's new to your content, wants to go binge, see what you're all about, where can they find you?
You can find me on TikTok at Jake Deyton1, Deyton.
Amazing. And I'll have that linked in the description for everybody. Jake, thank you so much for joining. I had so much fun chatting with you.
Me too. This was totally my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. Thank you guys for listening. Don't forget to rate and subscribe, leave a review, share it with a friend, give Jake a follow over on the Clock app. And as always, it's another great day to be live at the same time as Taylor Swift. Bye. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. I know all too well how busy life can be, and I am so grateful that you chose to stay. Now just know this is me trying, and I would greatly appreciate if you took a minute to leave a review or maybe share this episode with a fellow Swiftie. Make sure you join my broadcast channel on Instagram for more Swiftivities, and long story short, this love is real, and I'm beyond grateful for your support. See you next time!